This is Dateline, News, and Conversation. My guest tonight, the professor from Southeastern Norway University, Glenn Diesen. Glenn, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me back on.
Well, it's always a pleasure, and it's always informative when I speak with you. There's an awful lot of people in the United States that are giving their opinions about all things Russia, the war in Ukraine, but I don't know that there's anybody else, at least in terms of someone speaking English, that knows Russia as well as you do, that knows the Eurasian region better than you do. That's been your main focus of research and your publications, I believe. So I think that your voice is one of the most important voices that people really need to hear in the English-speaking world. And when I say English-speaking, I mean primarily the United States. That's basically the people that are following me. So I want to start out with this. You recently attended a conference in Minsk. I'm very curious to know what it's about, and what were the results?
Well, it was a conference on about the Eurasian Security. So again, in the capital of Belarus, Minsk. So it was about Eurasia effectively reorganizing itself and adjusting to a world in transformation, because as we all know, this period in time, which we refer to as the unipolar moment, has come to an end. So for your younger audience, they might be born into this period and might have been the only world they ever knew, which was from 1989 until almost 2020, or maybe 2016, 17. We had the only one central power, the United States, being the dominant power in the world, and so it effectively called a lot of the shots. It developed the concept of sovereignty, sovereign inequality, that is, based on how it saw fit, because the United States can of course interfere in your domestic affairs. They can use military force, can topple your government, can sever territory, and this is how the world has worked for 30 years. But there's no denying that the international distribution of power is now very different. The US is not anymore the dominant state, and for this reason the world is reorganizing. We have to find new ways of organizing security, economic connectivity, and for countries on this vast Eurasian continent that is spanning from the Atlantic to the Pacific, are seeking alternative ways. Obviously Europe is still hanging on to the United States, at least most of it, but we see now across the rest of Eurasia that they're all coming together in various formats, but all with the same kind of goal, which will be to diversify their economic connectivity, find different structures, institutions for security, and this is a huge event in history. So this was part of the topic in Minsk. Of course, you have a lot of the usual who come, which is the foreign minister of Russia, which is Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, of course, of Belarus. But interestingly, from Europe, Western Europe, we only had one, and that was the foreign minister of Hungary, because Hungary often in Europe becomes the odd man out, the one who's saying, listen, we have to also connect with the East. We can't just put all our eggs in one basket, that basket being the ever-shrinking West in terms of relative power. So they effectively see their position as benefiting from also having more connectivity with the East. So for that reason, they're the only one who came from Europe, at least from the government side, that is. So no, it's I think these conferences are quite important, because it shows how all the thoughts which are being made and decisions which are being made so rapidly as the world transforms.
Let me ask you this, Glenn. when we're talking about a security conference, the individual security needs and assurances of many different nations. Are we talking security from aggression, from wars, from attacks? Because when I think of security agreements, I think of what Russia pleaded with the United States and the West for were security assurances. The threat of an imminent war that Russia saw. So, are these other nations concerned about security from aggression from the United States, from NATO? Or are they also talking about economic security, cultural security? I mean, to me, this is a very complex concept about security. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's all of the above, because the US, which has been a hegemon for 30 years, a hegemon always have the incentive to promote universalism, because if you say we're all unified by common universal values, then you have the right to intervene in the affairs of other states if they don't abide by these norms. And also you can choose, that is allies, they can break the norms as you see fit, but not your adversaries, which is why, if, for example, the Saudi Arabian can get away with something the Iranians can't. So this is a way for the hegemon to get obedience. So this is one aspect. So a key issue is what I call civilizational diversity, which is the idea that every civilization should develop at its own path, its own speed and its own direction, that it shouldn't be dictated by one central power. So there is some discussion, economic security as well, because this has also been a very important case or example from this crisis we've been in over the past 2 years, especially. That is that the US and its allies, they tend to sanction everyone, and the one they sanction have been increasing, but also the scope of sanctions keep getting harsher. That is what they did to the Russians, seizing their funds of their central bank, kicking them off the SWIFT system to make payments, blocking banks. I mean, the list is so long. Just as an example, here in Europe now, if you have a Russian tourist coming, visiting Germany, they will seize their car and take it. And the reason why they passed, we have sanction policies against Russia, but they passed laws now in which they won't distinguish between imports and private use. So they can take, they can and they have seized cars of tourists. So it's very extreme measures being taken now. So it's something very different. So what they're talking about now is how can we have safe value chains, making sure that access to technologies, products, technologies are safe. How can you have reliable security corridors in which there won't be any blockades by the United States? To what extent can you have safe payment of banks, use of currencies? So there's a lot to discuss. But of course, at the center is also, energy, by the way, should also be clear, because energy security is also something that has been very weakened now, especially with the destruction of Nord Stream. It shows how far countries are willing to go, even blowing up the energy architecture of their own allies in order to hurt an adversary. So things have gone very far, but but also security. But it's not only seeking changing alliances as if this was the Cold War. Rather, it's seeking new ways of organizing security, because we almost gotten used to that the way security has been organized the past 30 years is just the way the world works. That if you want security, you have to join a US-led alliance. Otherwise, you're on the other side of the fence and you will have no security. So the way this security system has worked so far is that the US tends to divide regions and into allies versus adversaries. So if you're an ally, you will become dependent on the United States and cede some of your sovereignty. And meanwhile, adversaries can be weakened. So you see this across the board. That is the Arabs and the Saudis, if you maintain the conflict with Iran, Iran can be contained and weakened, while the Arabs become more dependent on the US. We saw how excited the American media got 3 years ago over the crisis in Himalayas, when the Indians had a clash with the Chinese, as American media were very open about. This was a great opportunity because now we will maybe get the Indians in on this alliance against the Chinese that will contain the Chinese, and the Indians will stop being so independent, and they will be forced to seek refuge under the US and US leadership. So this has kind of been the structure we had of security. But we see now that in this Eurasian format, a lot of the benefits come from pursuing common security, because it's economic connectivity which makes countries work together. So, for example, the Chinese and the Russians, for that sake, they would like to have closer economic ties with Iran, but they don't want to alienate the Arabs. So, for that reason, you have an incentive to harmonize or to resolve conflicts, which is why the Chinese went in and got this peace deal between the Iranians and the Saudis, because this is a good way to connect closer with both sides. So it's and this is what both the Chinese and the Russians have been saying. They don't want to do any alliances, because once you have an alliance, it's you alienate a third country. So it's a whole very different way of joining, of organizing security, and we kind of see that. So for in the ideal Eurasian format, for example, you wouldn't have Saudi Arabia and Iran joining a Chinese-led alliance to attack America. Instead, you would seek regional security to be organized collectively between the Saudis and the Iranians. So you pacify the region, and conflicts won't disrupt economic connectivity. So this is ideally, sorry, it became a very long answer, but it could be much longer, because it becomes quite complex, all the ways in which they envision to reorganize Eurasia.
Well, this is not the last time I hope that you and I can talk about this emerging multipolar world and security, including food security for all nations, and respecting the sovereignty. And I really love this phrase now, civilizational diversity. I don't know where that came from. I thought President Xi might have been the first one to talk about these civilizational differences, but it certainly is an important new concept that I hope will help more people understand that we are all different, and we cannot be forced into one mold, an American mold of democracy or capitalism or liberalism, whatever you want to call it. So I was really appreciative of that. But, I've met some cynical people, Glenn, who say that this is just another form of power being exercised primarily by the Chinese. What would you say to that? I mean, I know even some Russian people and friends of mine think that Russia is going to be like a sidecar to this big Chinese motorcycle. How would you respond to that?
Well, first, this discussion of civilizational diversity. The discussion of states in the format of civilizations become more and more common across Eurasia. But even Putin, last month I was at the Valdai in Sochi, and he was also talking about diversity of civilizations. But the Chinese, correctly, they even have a concept, what is called and I forgot the name, the civilizational initiative, or something along those lines. Anyways, the main topic of it, at least, is the main theme is that you have each civilization, they have their own path to modernity. So again, this is considered a very conservative idea, that you don't have to follow the footsteps of others. Each country have their own unique history, their own unique culture, and their own unique path to development. And I don't see it as a power grab. If anything, I think countries who are worried about the rise of China should be reassured, because once you have a huge country like China emerging now, and going to be more powerful than the United States, you want to know how it views the world. Now, if it would do like the United States, say, we're on a mission of universalism, liberalism, we're going to spread it across the world. Sovereignty has to bend if liberal democracy demands it. But so you would think that a huge hegemon would develop an ideology which weakens sovereignty by saying we're all the same effectively. But so what the Chinese are doing, as we see their huge powerful position coming forward, they're not saying this. They're saying, listen, the Russians, the Indians, the Europeans, you will all develop in your own way, in your own path. It's not for us in China to dictate to you how you should develop, how you should, what currencies to use, what banks, what kind of industrial development. It's all your history, your culture. So this should be reassuring, because often you see dominant states or very powerful states that begin to embrace ideologies of hegemony, in which you justify reducing the sovereignty of others. So I don't know. I just don't see it. I'm not saying the Chinese will grow up in the world and become the most the angels and not doing anything wrong, but in terms of calling for civilizational diversity, I think we should all breathe out. If this gave us a universal ideology, like here's Marxism, we will all have to march in footstep, follow what they're doing in Beijing, then we should all be worried, because now they're embracing an ideology in which they can interfere in our domestic affairs. And so far they haven't done that. So again, I think that's a good aspect.
A friend of mine who's been on the show a couple of times, Jeff J. Brown, is an American who lived in China for 16 years, speaks and writes the language, just returned from a month in traveling around parts of China. I put this question to him. Do you think this is going to be a power grab? Do you think China is going to want to become the hegemon? And he responded to me. He said, in all of China's history, when China has been trading with all parts of the world, never, ever did they ever try to colonize. They were interested in trade. And he said, and this surprised me, they were interested in the different cultures, art, and artifacts from all of these countries they visited. Do you have the same understanding of Chinese history, that they really never have been colonizers?
No, I tend to agree with that. If you look at how powerful they have been in the past, and the behavior, again, not perfect, but I don't see it as their own distinctive civilizational culture, if you want, if it's been inclined towards imperialism in any way. But again, we don't have to trust only the intentions of the Chinese. One of the benefits of a multipolar Eurasia is that if China would switch from being an economic leader to seeking political dominance, that's a very different, that's a great leap to take. And if they do that, you would see Eurasia turning against them, which is why it's good to have multipolarity. Because at the moment, if this greater Eurasia, which the Chinese are building, should work, they really have to get along with the other countries on the Eurasian continent. Now, for the Russians, for example, they don't mind China being the leading economy. However, if they would start to interfere in the domestic affairs of Russia and try to subordinate them, and again, transition from being a merely leader to seeking dominance, you would see a very different response from the Russians. They would then seek to cooperate more with India. They would lean more towards Europe. And this is why the Russians, for example, have this north-south transportation corridor, where they link themselves closer with Iran and India. India is also connecting themselves closer with Central Asia and all the way to Turkey. So everyone is diversifying. And this is a positive thing, because once countries have diversify their partnerships, it becomes more difficult for states to take advantage. So usually what you see is we tend to treat economic interdependence as simply being this force for good, something everyone benefits from. However, in interdependent relationship, one is always more dependent on the other. There's asymmetry. For example, between Russia and China, there's it's an asymmetrical relationship. China is much more economically powerful. So, but what's the way you can overcome it is you can have some strategic autonomy, which Russia does, but you can also diversify. That means if China becomes bullying and trying to take advantage of its strong position, Russia can just focus its economic ties on others. This is what they did to the Europeans, which we didn't understand. We began to put sanctions on the Russians. We began to use the Ukrainians as a proxy to fight the Russians, and they simply began to diversify. They became dependent on industries, technologies, transportation corridors, banks, currencies of the East rather than the West. And this is because the West began to use this economic power again to bully the Russians. And the same would apply to China. If they, in the future, begin to be aggressive, they can do the same. And it's not just Russia. You would have the same sentiment across from the Middle East and Africa and Central Asia, definitely India. So I think this idea that we're trading an American hegemon for a Chinese one, it's simply not the case. The United States, I think, would be an incredibly valuable state in the international system if it could accept a more moderate role, that is, to be one center of power in a multipolar world. What's problematic with the United States is its insistence on international dominance, that it should have global primacy, be the most powerful states and have the final say in every corner of the world. As long as this is the security strategy, it becomes a threat to almost everyone. And but so far, the economic system and security and the civilizational initiative that the Chinese are advancing suggests that they're not doing this. They are indeed pursuing multipolarity, and this is a good system, because if they turn aggressive, other countries will simply reduce economic connection to them, and they will begin to decouple. So I just don't see this imperialist argument. I think this is more propaganda that don't trust the Chinese, stay with the American hegemon. So
here's the big question. Do you think that the United States of America will eventually recognize its place as one among equals in this multipolar world? Do you think they can do that? Or do you think that maybe recognizing that they've lost this battle for world domination might do something totally insane that threatens all life on the planet?
Well, you're correct. That is the big question. I would say 5-10 years ago, I think that the Americans were already faced with this question, where they had a dilemma. That is, on one hand, that they could either develop a multipolar system, construct one favorable to the United States, where the US will be, as they say, the first among equals. That is, we're all equals, but among the equals, the US will be the leading one. That would be one option. Alternatively, the United States would use its force to try to weaken all rising adversaries and try to cement its dominant position. Now, on this format, one would expect, they can buy themselves a few more years, but in return, other rising powers, seeing now the US preventing their rise as opposed to accommodating it, would seek to create a multipolar system, not just against the United States. So defining it to a large extent as being against decoupling from America, protecting themselves military-wise against America. And I think over the past 10 years, this is what we've seen developing, because the US chose to do whatever it takes to preserve unipolarity. And I think this is a lot of the crisis we have now. That is, you mentioned before, the unwillingness to negotiate over Ukraine, for example, in 2021, and continue to push this military infrastructure closer to Russian borders, obviously was an attempt to weaken Russia. And even after the war was started, as we now know, all these efforts to prevent any peace agreements, which the Ukrainians and Russians almost made, again, had the same objective. That is, we can use this to fight the Russians, weaken the Russians, and if we can knock out the Russians, then the Chinese will stand on their own, and then we have more chance of weakening and destroying them as well. So it's it's definitely something that can take the world to the abyss, because of course now we're fighting a proxy war against the Russians in Ukraine, which seemingly can go nuclear at any time, the way we're escalating now. Any day a drone can hit a nuclear power plant in Russia and they will have to retaliate. Again, this happens now with greater frequency. At the same time, we have this war in the Middle East. As soon as this happened, the Israelis saw it as an opportunity to clear out Gaza. Many in America see it as an opportunity to take on Iran, and and at the same time they want to go after China. So there is things can spiral out of control very quickly, and what I'm hoping is that these conflicts can be resolved or mitigated in some way. And if again, the way the Chinese see it, at least, is time is on their side. So if only the relative decline of the US can continue, they would be in a position where the US would at some point have to adjust to realities. That is, they can't reassert the dominance. They would see this is a ridiculous proposition, and the best path forward would be simply to make a peace and find a way of coexisting on this planet. So I would like to stay optimistic, but every day gives me more reason for pessimism.
As an American and as a student of American history, I know that the United States was founded on genocide of the Native Americans, the original peoples. It was based on slavery, the theft of labor, land, and resources. And throughout America's history, that seems to have been its quest. But the other thing that I know from the earliest days of the founding of the Republic, American presidents, and I think maybe almost all the way up until just before World War I, were isolationist. They didn't want to have to deal with the problems of other countries. We pretty much wanted to stay home. Americans did not want to enter World War I. They did not want to enter World War II, but we got our Pearl Harbor, and there you have it. So I'd like to think, but I don't hold out much hope, that America might not return to its roots from the 15th century, but to the founding principles of this country, that all men are created equal, with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now, I know that the founding fathers probably thought all men referred just to them, but those words have taken on new meaning over the centuries. And I think now when we talk about this multipolar world, are we not talking about these God-given, creator-given, inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? I'd like to think that America could return to those values.
No, I agree, and I think that would be one of the main incentives as well for the United States to reconsider this proposition of being one among equals. Is at the moment, by continuing to pursue hegemony, which doesn't work anymore, it doesn't reflect reality. Not only is the US exhausting its resources, which is bringing a lot of economic inequality, and it's also incentivizing a lot of great powers around the world, or large powers at least, to balance the US collectively, but it's also exhausting the US internally. It's society itself, the democratic structure. So a lot of this is suffering greatly under this system. It's even Brzezinski once wrote in one of his books as well, and from '97, when he advocated for unipolarity, arguing that this can be a challenging path because you can't remain a democracy and an empire at the same time. And I think time has proven now that this is very correct. But that's all. I also think that when talk about multipolarity and overcoming U.S. hegemony, that this is it shouldn't be considered an anti-American statement. It should be, I think the United States would be a much more durable country, and it was founded on some excellent principle and ideals as well. So if you can Of course, not all of them have been lived up to properly, as you pointed out, with genocide and slavery. But I think no country is perfect. But I think if you would have a moderate position in the international system, it would be much better for itself and the world. And well, I'm reminded about this paragraph, which you actually find in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. It's a paragraph which refers to the discovery of America and Americas and the East Indies as being the two greatest discoveries in human history. This opened up for connectivity, trade, and cultural exchanges. All this, it was as he called it, two greatest discoveries. But then what you usually, an honesty you don't always find, was he writes that this was also a huge tragedy and devastation for the indigenous peoples of the places that we went, that is the Europeans, causing huge death and destruction and exploitation. But this wasn't because human beings can't connect, but he defined this as being caused by the huge asymmetries. That is, you had too much power concentrated in Europe compared to the rest of the world, and this meant that the connection of the world became a endeavor of exploitation. That this is quite natural. You have a super powerful a continent meeting much weaker ones. This will lead in their destruction, not a great connectivity. So he actually wrote, Adam Smith, that ideally in the future, these countries will grow a bit stronger, or Europe grow weaker, and this would allow for a more stable and peaceful world. Now, I tend to agree with this, which is why I don't necessarily want to see Europe weaken, given I live here, but I would like to see the rest of the world strengthened, because I don't think that having this huge power disparity is in our advantage, because it causes us to end up in these relationships where which are very exploitative, and not only does it bring havoc for them, but it destroys some of the soul of Europe, if you will, making us occupiers and exploitators. So I don't think this is the ideal format. And so again, I tend to be quite positive about Eurasian integration, not seeing it as being cheering on the East and hoping that the West will sink into the ocean or anything like this.
Yeah, well, I've always believed in the concept of a rising tide raises all boats. This planet, if we could learn to work together, can bring not only peace, but prosperity to everyone. And that's why I think what's happening on this geopolitical level that you are so much involved with, I think is holding out hope for humanity and for the future. We can only pray that the United States and its vassals don't do something crazy. I want to shift gears now to you mentioned it just briefly, the conflict that's taking place now in the Middle East. I'd like your thoughts on this, because I've been reading a lot and talking to a number of people. On the one hand, there are the conspiracy theorists who believe that Israel allowed this to happen so that it would be their 9/11, their reason for going all out war against these terrorists in Palestine, Hamas. There are others that would say, no, that Israel was lax, they were too arrogant, too caught up in their own hubris, that they were taken by surprise. Before we get into what this conflict could spiral into, what are your thoughts on those two positions, or maybe something in between?
Well, I haven't seen any evidence, so it would be just, I guess it would be pure speculations, I think. But there were reports, of course, that in advance that Hamas might plan an attack, but that doesn't mean that there has to be a conspiracy. I think hubris is more likely, that the Israelis, see themselves as all powerful, and in Gaza you have, the Palestinians locked behind the walls, gonna attack Israel. So I think I think they underestimated Hamas, but of course, maybe they wouldn't mind conflict as well as a reason to resolve some other conflicts. But my impression was that there was some hubris at play, and once they actually attacked, they were taken off guard and surprised by this. Of course, I could be wrong, but either way, I think that it's definitely been exploited, because this idea that they're going to take out the Hamas leadership and just make sure this doesn't happen again, retaliate. I don't think that's the only game they're playing. I see that. Well, I would expect, at least from where I'm sitting. Again, I could be wrong, but I think they're gonna do something major to Gaza. So annex parts of Gaza, try to push them all into Egypt. I really don't know, but what they're doing now, entering with ground forces, clearing entire parts of the population, planting Israelis flags. I mean, this if I was betting, I would suggest that they're going to do some ethnic cleansing and annexation.
Well, what are your thoughts on the rest of the Arab Muslim world, not only in that region, but across the planet? People are angry. The Muslims, the Arabs are angry at what's happening. Do you think that they will either decide, you know what, they've got to stand together and support one another, or do they sit back and just allow it to happen? I see this as, they talked about World War III had already begun, some people, with the United States war on Russia. I think this conflict could be more explosive than what was happening in Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think in this one, escalation control is more challenging, more difficult, because in Ukraine, the United States, since 2014, they pretty much took over the state. The sovereignty was suspended. They, as you already know, the new finance minister then of Ukraine was an American. Across the board, a lot of top positions were filled by foreigners, American educated. There were, a lot of top positions had to be cleared by the Americans. So the United States have controlled Ukraine to a large extent since 2014. And in terms of the war, the Americans provide the weapons, the intelligence, the training, the ammunition. They've done pretty much everything. So it's been an American war to a large extent. So they could control at least how it went, the risks they're willing to take, when it's time to de-escalate, when they want to escalate. But there's greater control over it, make sure things don't spiral out of hand. But this is very different in the Middle East, because first of all, American troops are getting directly involved, but also there's no way to control the escalation. As they go into Gaza now, it's hard to say how this will resolve itself. If they're unable to do ethnic cleansing, are they going to do genocide? I mean, this is going to kill a lot of these people. And also, if they lose control of the war there, they're going to get the West Bank getting involved, and of course Hezbollah coming in from the north. They will make Hamas look, like toddlers. They will come with a great fighting power, and you mentioned the Arabs, but of course you have the Persians. You have all the way to Indonesia. There's a lot of countries now deeply dissatisfied with what's happening. Even Turkey, I think Erdogan 2 days ago threatened that they might step in and intervene militarily. Personally, I think he blows a lot of hot air, I think the Turk expression is, but I don't think they would do it. But certainly it reflects a lot of the pressure there and the mood, which is saying that this is unacceptable. They can't let this continue. And you see even from Jordan, Egypt, definitely Iran. Iran could intervene more heavily, maybe through one of its proxies like Hezbollah, or even directly. I think again, this can go out of control so quickly. And even if the Iranians don't intervene, the Americans, a lot of American hawks who would like to take advantage of this destabilized situation to go after the Iranians. So it's the whole thing can blow up very quickly. And of course, if the United States places itself on the ground, what would the Russians and Chinese do? I mean, the Russians, keep in mind that the Americans have been killing Russians in the tens of thousands now for 2 years, and during this time, the Russians haven't had a way of making the Americans pay a cost, because the Americans been only fighting through proxies. But now with American troops on the ground, the Russians can help make the Americans pay a price for what they're doing against the Russians in Ukraine. So this can just completely get out of control. And why wouldn't China or Russia give any weapons to any actors in the region to help them defend themselves after this is what we've been doing in Ukraine? So it's I'm not saying that any of this is right or wrong. I'm just saying the possibilities of this conflict expanding in any direction is just too great. It's I'm quite surprised that so many are pushing for this war now without seemingly thinking about the possible ways this can go wrong.
Well, from everything I'm hearing in the United States, the entire government is, we stand with Israel. We're going to support Israel. We're sending them billions more dollars in weapons and all of that. And the mantra that you hear is Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, do not the Palestinians have that same right? What's going on there, I think, is genocide, and has been genocide. It's an occupied territory. And so the question I say is, well, okay, if Israel has the right to defend itself, do not the Palestinians? What are your thoughts?
Well, these are the slogans we have during wars, Israel has the right to defend itself. Yeah, sure, they have the right to defend themselves, but there needs to be some context. What does, like you said, shouldn't Palestinians have the right to defend themselves? But of course, you can't say that, because then it will be interpreted as supporting, the terrorist attack of Hamas. But certainly, but also not just the right of the Palestinians to defend themselves, but also proportionality. They killed thousands of people. I think more than 3,000 children now. This is one of the most densely populated parts of the world, and with half the population being underaged. And if you're watching the videos, they're just almost carpet bombing it, just dropping bombs on huge residential buildings, everything collapsing. I mean, this is extremely brutal. So it's these slogans we say during war. I mean, we do that in Ukraine as well. We say, hey, if the Russians leave, the war is over tomorrow. It's like, no, it's not. If the Russians go home and leave, NATO will cement themselves in Ukraine, and this is deemed to be an existential threat to Russia. So then the real war will really begin. So it's just empty slogans. It doesn't mean much. But I'd just like to add on the idea of standing by Israel. It can be interpreted in many ways. Whenever we want to support a country or stand by them, it for some reason always means to support the most hawkish elements of society. In Ukraine, what did it mean to stand by Ukraine? Did it mean we would respect the majority of the population who didn't want a coup, who voted for 73% for Zelensky's platform of implementing the Minsk agreement, restoring peace with Russia? No, standing with Ukraine meant we would support the extreme nationalists who wanted to go to war with Russia. And it's the same in Israel. Standing with Israel means to go in and fight Palestinians. But I don't think this is necessarily in Israel's interest. I think my fear is that this could be the undoing of Israel. If this escalates beyond control, I don't think the United States would be in a position to save them. If it ends up with this, spreading to West Bank, Hezbollah coming in from the north, all the Arab states joining in, not all, but one or several, this will be devastating. This is not the 1970s anymore. The Arab states have grown much more powerful. Their military is more powerful. this is a terrible situation Israelis are putting themselves in. So I don't know. I think standing with Israel would mean, find a solve this conflict as soon as possible, and not just temporarily, but then implement a two-state system. Keep in mind that Israel has been able to avoid any peace negotiation or enduring peace agreement with the Palestinians for so long because America has been all powerful, and America will always have the final say. Well, America's in relative decline, and its neighbors are growing much more powerful. This is a terrible idea to, if you think that your position is going to be weaker tomorrow than it is today, then you make a peace agreement today. So I think that we might be helping Israel in the same way that we've been helping Ukraine destroy itself. And this is my main concern, because if Israel goes down, they will bring the Palestinians with them and much of the neighborhood. So I see this as being a very dangerous road.
You mentioned a two-state solution. The United States and Israel have not wanted that. I think that's pretty obvious. But a good friend of mine, a retired attorney, a peace activist, and a journalist, Dimitri Laskaris, on my show earlier this week or last week, he said, no, the two-state solution is not the solution. He said a one-state where all parties have equal rights, Jews, Christians, Muslims. Do you think that's just utopia? Do you think it's just an impossibility? Is there any possibility in your mind?
Well, the problem is we've seen what one state looks like. It's an apartheid state. I know you're not allowed to say that, but even the former head of Mossad said that Israel is it's an apartheid state because by definition they have one set of rules for one group of people and one set of rules for another. So this is I'm not sure. Ideally, it would be a solution, but I think for the Israelis, they would be too worried about the demographics because they've had conflicts for too long. The Palestinians tend to have more children than the Israelis, the Jews that is, and I think they would be worried that the entire concept of a Jewish state would be destroyed if they would have a one state which wouldn't be apartheid. So it's I get it. I think it might be a bit utopian, but of course it would be if it could work, it would be great. I don't see it happening, but I don't disagree with this pessimism on the two-state solution. I think it's been sabotaged for so long; it would be almost impossible to return to the 67 borders.
Okay, do you think, given the interest now that China has shown in the Middle East, that Russia has shown in the Middle East, and with the United States' power and influence in rapid decline, do you think then China and Russia now will have more of a hand and a say in the outcome?
Probably more. Well, now that the United States not only show that they fully support the Israelis in this very destructive attack on Gaza, but even sending their troops and now the warships, I think you can't really negotiate anymore once you picked one side like this. So I think that as the influence of Russia and China grows in the region, they will probably have more of a say. And it's interesting that they also have they try to have a more balanced position in the region. They don't want to go against the Israelis, especially the Russians. They've always been very empathetic to Israel and never wanted to be too critical. On the other hand, as we saw over the past 2 years, the Russians feel also that the Israelis stabbed them in the back in Ukraine by sending weapons, providing intelligence, sending Mossad up there, offering training. So there's a sense of betrayal as well. So one shouldn't take for granted, of course, that they would stand by the Israelis through thick and thin after this.
Well, Glenn, when we talk about security, Eurasian security, European security, American security, it sure would be a good thing if the United States could realize that their security now has been threatened like it's never been threatened before. You mentioned that, I'll paraphrase it, America's in crisis. America is being torn apart from within, doesn't need anybody interfering from Russia or anywhere else. It's lost its moral compass. Americans are divided against each other over a whole multitude of issues. And as an American living abroad, I look at that and I weep for the country in which I was born. I do not recognize it anymore. And my only hope, Glenn, for the United States of America is not an awakening, but an acknowledgement, a rediscovery of who they are and what they could be and mean to the rest of the world. I share your thoughts, Glenn. I'm not very hopeful. You know, at the end of a film that I made, it was called 30 Seconds to Midnight. I may have mentioned this before. It was about the threat of nuclear war between Russia and the United States. And that's why I came to Russia in the first place, to find out the truth. At the end of that, I said, will the neocons, or whoever you want to call them in the United States, recognizing they have lost this epic battle for the future control of the planet, take the whole world down with them in a nuclear Armageddon? I think that's what we're looking at today. Glenn, I can't thank you enough for your insight, your knowledge, and your wisdom. I look forward to having you back again soon.
Yeah, I hope to be back on. Just one last comment is on what you said. Senator Rand Paul, he made a similar argument once. He said that the option was not about keeping hegemony or giving it up. He said it's about either dismantling empire now in an orderly way or waiting for the collapse, because when the currency, the economy, or social fabric, something tears apart, it will be a very messy ordeal. So that's why he argued for an orderly pullback. So yeah, for the benefit of Americans, that's what I would be hoping for as well. Anyways, thanks again for having me on.